All right, so the first presentation, the presentation today is about use Cookbook advanced recipes for every web occasion. My name is Anna Mikhailova. I'm Associate Director of Technology at Kalamuna, and you can connect with me by email. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a Drupal 7 and 8 Acquire certified Gradmaster on my road to Drupal 9 Gradmaster. I am a nature enthusiast and a dog lover, so if I'm not pushing pixels and writing code, I am outside, probably taking some pictures of flowers. And I have a dog named Simba. A fun fact is he's named after a cat. So you can comment in the chat if you're a dog or cat person, or maybe neither. It's all right. Everybody is welcome here. So if you would like to connect with me after the session, please feel free to ping me on Twitter as well. My handle is @SunnyYenotic. And let's get rolling. I work for Kalamuna, and it happened to be that we're currently hiring. We're hiring for the majority of roles, from the lead front-end developers to the WordPress lead developers, and also backend developers and architects. Please find our job posting on our website or connect with me directly, and I will be happy to talk to you about those opportunities. Without further ado, what we will be covering today. So today we will be talking about views, but about views in depth. So we'll talk about views build and render cycle in greater details. We'll talk about views, hooks, and real-world scenarios. It's important to understand not just what hooks are available for you, but also all the real-world scenarios that might go for your requirements, and then which hook to use for every real-world scenario. And we will cover views plugins and which one to use and when, and what would you need to define each of the plugins. So let's get rolling. We will start with views build and render cycle. All right, views build and render cycle consists of 4 stages. There are preview stage, build stage, execution stage, and render stage, and we will cover all of them in details in a second. The preview stage, the view object is just about to be processed. So view, in a nutshell, under the hood, is an object, and it's a PHP object, and this object is about to be processed. So it's a good time to add new arguments to the arguments array, to update your contextual filters, switch the active display. So basically, alter the conditions with which this object will be processed. So that's a fantastic time for that. The next stage is build stage. So view object is being processed. So the handlers running, the displays are being attached, and arguments are being processed. And the view is being actually constructed. At that moment, query isn't built yet, just the object is. So we get everything. Like if you're thinking of a view as building a house, at this stage, we are building the foundation. So in the first stage, in the pre-built one, we will kind of drafting a plan, you know, like an architectural mock-up of a house. Now we're actually starting building the foundation for it, but the walls are not there yet. So our query isn't being built yet. And, you know, the frame isn't there yet. Displays are attached, meaning that the foundation is fully built and we have a basement and everything that's needed there. And we started putting in the, you know, all the other communications. By the end of this phase, the query is built. So we finished the foundation and we started building the, you know, the walls of the house. And it's ready to be executed. So we're ready to start putting finishing touches and build the house above the ground. On the execution state, we have query that is being executed. And when the query is being executed, that's actually when we start putting in siding and, you know, windows and doors and everything else. And we actually have rooms now because we have our array of results that is being constructed. On the next stage, we have a render stage. In the render stage, we have 2 sub-stages, pre-render and a post-render. In the pre-render, we are processing handlers or plugins, and we haven't rendered anything yet, but we kind of starting processing things up. So think of it as a, you know, draft finishing. So you kind of have draft finishing on the walls, maybe your you know, drywall is putting up, but there is no finishing paint yet. There is nothing like that. In the post-render cycle, we actually rendered the results and ready to output it. So that's like putting a paint coat on top of your walls. That's happening in the post-render cycle, and then the view is being rendered. So After that, let's talk about hooks and real-world scenarios. Preview hooks. So one of the most common preview hooks is hooks view preview. So you would use it for conditionally switching active display. So if you have different filters, I'll tell you a scenario. For example, you have a site with different conditions, like a personalization site, and you have a lot of filters for this specific view display. So maybe you have like 5, 6 filters, you have groups, and you have those filters kind of and or conditions. So it's very complicated logic and filters. So if you start thinking about doing hook query alter, that may or may not go so well because you have so many nested conditions. It's difficult to drill down to just this one, and it's just kind of difficult to build a generic alteration for the query. But you may want to alter just one thing. So let's say if it is in a different context, so in a different region, for example, you may want to just render a view display for Canada versus a view display for US. In this case, you can use hook views prebuilt to switch active display, and that will allow you to not worry about the filters and specify different filter criteria per the display. It only works well, obviously, if you have a limited amount of these conditions, because if you were to have 20 different regions, having 20 displays on a view can become performance intense. However, if you have like 3 to 5, that's an optimal solution. And if you don't have to, and the filters are significantly different and you don't want to write a query, then you can definitely just do a hook view previews to swap displays. Another great example for that would be if you were to have a search view. So sometimes you have a search view and the requirements is if the search returns no result, refine the filter with the default display that might be attached to the view, or refine it with a different filters. So for example, a user is looking for books of a certain genre, and they put too narrow and the fastest return no results. You can actually have a backup display that is powered not by search API, but actual just a view listing that can be fired out of it, or still powered by search API, but just with a more relaxed kind of criteria, so that you can say, you can also look, or your search yield no result, but you can check those results in case they are of interest. So that's another option for using switching the active displays. You can update contextual filters as well in this hook. So sometimes, you have something a little bit more elaborate than a typical taxonomy, and views doesn't provide the processor for it. Sometimes you could definitely write your custom contextual filter, and that's an option. But if you don't want to write the entire filter and you just need to process the result a little bit, just to help you just a little bit, like for example, it's still in taxonomy, but instead of a taxonomy ID, you need to value of a field. This is a hook for you. You can process the argument and pass that correct contextual filter to the arguments array and take the full advantage of your taxonomy term. Right, the next one is build hooks. We are moving into the build phase, and there are 2 main hooks. There are more hooks that are happening on this phase, but we are focusing on the ones that are more commonly used. So hooks use pre-build and hook views query alter. So in the pre-build, those are altering the list of attachment displays. So if you go to use our attachments, so one display is an attachment of another, this is your chance to alter those and reattach them. Again, you can kind of pre-query the view to check the results, and based on that, reattach the displays. So it's not switching the active display, it's attaching additional displays in here. Another one is hook views query alter, which allows you to obviously alter the query, add conditions, source, and grouping. The most common use case would be, if you have a lot of joins and you start seeing duplication, and instead of using aggregation on a view's UI, it might take sometimes a little bit difficult to construct an aggregated query, because you have to put this aggregation condition on every single field, and it may or may not be working as expected. So the easiest would be to go in and alter the query object to add group by right in the query alter. Another great example would be to alter query and pass some additional condition, or process some different logics and remove certain filters, or add sorts based on other business logic. So that's the situation when you would use hook views query alter. Keep in mind that this returns a little bit different query structure based on who provides views underline, or who provides the views content. So if you were to use search API and search index for the query, the query will look a little bit differently than a query to the content, because search API has a different query object. So if you were to use this alteration and you want to kind of cascade it through multiple views, export your query object as a KSM or Kint through the devel module and check that the structure is still the same, so that your logic continues to work throughout all the displays and on different views. The next one is execute hooks. So hook views pre-execute and hook views post-execute. They're like twin brothers. One is acting on the array of results prior to it to query, and another one after the query. So this is the last opportunity to alter views object before query is called. So basically, the last time for you to make any alteration to your view construction and tell Drupal that that it needs to be built in a different way. And the next one is hook views post-execute. So this one has information about all the results. So that's fantastic if you were to build custom pager, or if you were to build a custom rendering or pre-rendering operations. This is when you will know exactly all of the results, and you can add additional variables about them and messaging about them. If you were to build custom pages, that's great, because you can just render all of them and construct pages you'd like. This is also the perfect hook to hook in and update your no results method, or attach something else, or render custom markup if you have no results. So lots of possibilities in there. The next one is render hooks. Again, two twin brothers, pre-render and post-render. This is the pre-render one you will use prior to rendering. So you don't have a rendered markup yet. You have all of your results. They're being built, and they're processed by the field handlers, but they haven't been rendered yet. So you have render arrays instead of rendered markup. Unlike all the other hooks that we just covered, this one is the first hook in the render build cycle of a view that can be called from the scene layer. So that means that you don't have to define your custom module, you can actually call it from the scene, which is an advantage for people who are more on the front end or theming side of things, that they don't have to define a custom module. So this one allows you to alter the render elements of the results prior to them being rendered. And it's very useful. In the most of the cases, I'd recommend to use this one. Sometimes you may run into situations when you would want a lazy builder. And in there, with the rendering array, you will not see the markup, so won't be able to alter this output. So in this case, you will switch to post-render function. So in the post-render function, results are already converted into markup objects, and this markup string can be manipulated with regular expression. It's very useful if you were to have some, custom logic into the footer and header and of the view, or maybe just, concatenate a couple values together, or massage output in any other way. This is where you would use it. The advantage of it is a rendered markup, so you can alter a little bit more than in the pre-render, where it's all mostly like a render element properties. And in this hook, you can also alter cache tags, which is very important. You can set cacheable dependencies. You can create a cacheable metadata object out of your build array and add it as a cacheable dependencies to the view, and that will help you to set up more custom cache tags than if you were to use just what Drupal views are doing by default. So yeah, that's very useful, and you can make the cache for your views results way more granular this way. View plugins. The third and biggest section of this presentation is views plugins. So views plugins are divided into two main categories. They are plugins and handlers. And what's the difference? Well, in terms of how they build, there is no difference, but semantically, there are differences between them. So plugins are plugins which are participating in views construction, creation process. They are responsible for the wizard build process, rows, displays, pagers, cache, and more. And then handlers are plugins that participate in the build process of the query object. So they actually participate in the filtering, contextual filtering, sorting, and relationships. So handlers are everything that's related for the query. They are handling the query object, and plugins themselves are just building. They're like construction pieces or kind of blocks or bricks. Not to confuse it with Drupal terminology, but blocks or bricks in the real world to build your house. So structural objects. Let's go down the road and to field handler plugin. So the field handler plugin, as a majority of our plugins that will be defined for the views, have to live in a specific folder. They all have to be in a custom module, but they also have to be placed in this certain folder structure. So for example, plugins views field is a namespace and folder structure for your field plugins. You also will need to annotate it with the add views field annotation that has a plugin ID. This is a short annotation, and some of the plugins require a more long, elaborate annotation. I will point out to those, but this one just will have a plugin ID, a machine name of the plugin that will be used throughout the site when people instantiating the plugin, altering it, and using it around. It also will be how views recognizes the plugin for you. In this plugin, you will have to define two methods, at least two methods. It's a build options form, which allows you to define field options. So when editors or administrators of your website add the field through the view, they will see this option forms for the options on your field, and that will help them to customize your field in a way, or choose the widget, or choose a different option that you would like to expose for them in that form. And then there is also a render function. Render function basically returns the rendered markups of the field. So when would you use this? You would use it if you have a flat table. So for example, if you were to have custom entity, then the integration is in a different way in Drupal 8 and Drupal 9. You will use entity annotation to attach your views handlers in there and expose entity fields to the views. But if you were to have a custom table, like a flat table with multiple fields, then you would want sometimes to expose this to the views as well. This is the way to do it. You can define custom plugins for different fields on these tables, and then use it in a view as if you were to have it on an entity. You don't have to have an entity in order to work with this custom table in the view. And then you also will might use it for the pseudo computed field. So sometimes if you were to have, let's say, a recipe content type, and you have a cook time and a prep time, and you would like to expose a total recipe time and then multiply it by the difficulty factor on the recipe, then you can do all of this process and store it in a pseudo computed field and then expose that field in the view. Now, granted, you can also do it in a preprocess or in a template itself, but I'm just giving you the simplest example. Obviously, for performance, sometimes computed field might be a better option. All right, the next one is a filter plugin. So a filter plugin, similar to field plugin, lives inside the filter namespace. And it needs a views filter annotation that has plugin ID. So very similar to the field one. We need to define three methods: value form, which is the filter form that will be displayed when you expose the filter through the filter interface in the view. So if you were to, let's say, expose the date, it will be a date widget, and things like that. So in query, is modify the query. Because you are filtering, you need to modify the query object of the view. So you add in your own custom kind of query snippet that can be used in the view. So that query is responsible to altering this object. Typically, it expects you to add some sort of MySQL or whatever database backend you use string that will be adding a condition. So you can use normal methods for query altering, like add where and group by and other things to alter your query object. Admin summary is a summary for editors in the Views UI. So when you add your custom filter, this function allows editors to see what the filter is about, its help text and description and other properties, so they easily identified in the UI of Views. So the example where you would want a custom filter would be a custom date range filter. So for example, on the big publishing website, sometimes the requirement is, I want all of the articles that were published last week, last month, last quarter, 3 years ago. So it's very arbitrary, not something that Drupal provides by default. You may want to hard-code those specific ranges into the custom filter and filter this way. Or you can, again, filter by computed properties. Just going back to that previous example of a field where you had different, recipe time, you may want to filter by those computed times. And this is an option for you to actually add it as a custom filter as well. The next one is a sort plugin. So the sort plugin has a namespace of a sort. So similarly, following the same pattern, it will need a view sort annotation. And you need to push an ID inside that annotation. And then it has to have at least one method, which is a query. And that as well modifies the query object. So again, it expects you to pass some sort of string, subquery string into the query object to modify it and add a custom sort. The key here is to understand that you need to actually alter the MySQL query versus the result. So you're not really processing results. You're telling views how to query that thing correctly. And that is applicable for the filter and for the sort plugins. And that made me very confused when I first tried to do it. So my idea behind it for successful implementation is to open your MySQL or whatever database backend you may have editor and just query it in a SQL syntax. And then when you do have the query that works and returns the result as you expect, this is where you would subtract that substring for the sort out of it and push it back into the query object in views. So very helpful. One of the examples that you would have in the real world is natural sort. And I know there are a couple modules that provide it, but in a nutshell, what natural sort is, for example, you have a list of results with articles, the main article, or like the great whole, or it has numbers, something like that. And the requirement of your site is to have actually the first actual word to be responsible for sorting and drop the articles and help words. That's what you would use to establish it as a custom sort plugin, and you can make sure that those phrases are omitted. The second one would be to sort by computed values. In this case, you could actually, if you don't have a first name and a last name into separate fields and you would like to sort by last name only, you can actually break down the full name field into two values by a space if they separated by space, and pass the last name as a sorting column, as a computed sorting column, and then sort it this way. So the custom sort plugin comes in handy right here. So area handlers. Area handlers, similar to the sort, they go into views area namespace and need the annotation views area that grabs a plugin ID. It needs three methods: define options, again, default options for the handler. That's important because sometimes people don't press on settings and reconfigure the views. So the easiest is just to push some defaults for your options that will be exposed to the editor. The second method is build option forms. That actually is a form that allows to provide the interface for these options. So options form for editors, and then a render. The last one returns a valid Drupal render array for that area handler. The basic example would be a header, a footer area that is custom and has, let's say, a backlink to the previous page using browser history API, or it has some custom messaging based on the business logic, things like that. So that would be the best example for a custom area handler. The advantage of having area handler instead of just preprocessing it is that you can reuse it throughout multiple views as long as it is very generic. So that if you have that backlink, you can actually reuse it on multiple pages, and you don't have to do preprocess for every single views display everywhere where you may need it. Access handler, it's a very fun one. This provides an access to the view block or view page, and it's custom. It needs a views access annotation that has plugin ID, title, and help, so a little bit bulkier annotation than typical. It has at least 3 methods, and they are required because access handler is required to extend from the base class that is abstract and defines 3 methods that have to be implemented. First is summary title. That is a title that appears in the views UI when you add the access callback. So when you click on the access and there is like by role or by permission, that will be the third one where you will define by what basically, or like custom editorial access, something like that. And you have to have access callback. So access callback is a custom callback where you can define your custom callback access logic. So that is where you check permissions or field values or anything else, and determine if the user can access or cannot access your view. And then alter out definition. It's required. So you could actually have exactly the same logic there as an access. So the reason why we have those 2 methods is because one is called for the pages and it's called on route, means that the access is checked so early in the process that it kind of doesn't go through the rendering of the view or through the build process of the view. Whereas in the access method, it does go through the process of building the view and then checking the access. So putting this on the alter out definition means that you are optimizing the performance. And if you do it in the alter out definition, this is when on the page displays, it will show access denied. However, on block displays, this method is not going to be called. You can also add additional permissions or role restriction to the alter out definition to make it a little bit more robust. You don't have to do it. You can keep it at true and just rely on your access callback instead. Another option here is to call a service. So abstract all of the logic into a helper service where you can put all of the logic for the access and additional permissions and role, and call the service access call methods out of the access callback and out of the alter out definition. That's another option that you can pursue. So that's pretty self-explanatory. One of the normal use cases would be if you were to have it, let's say on a user, you will have a field with a checkbox saying residential editor or just an editor. A residential editor should be able to see lists of unpublished content that is ready for review, and normal editor shouldn't. And the rest of the permissions are exactly the same. So this is a good way to restrict just the view access to that specific view display. Style plugin is the fun one, the one that allows you to render results as a whole in a certain way. So it lives under the view style namespace, and it needs a view style annotation that has plugin ID, it has title, help, theme, and display types. Those properties are very important, specifically theme and display types. Theme defines a template that will be used for the rendering of your style plugin, and display types identifies to which displays that plugin should be available. If you want just the normal ones, like content ones, so blog and page and master, you can just use the normal value into this keyword. And then you have a defined options function that allows you, again, to specify default options for the plugin. And then build options form, similar to other plugins we just looked at, that allows you to expose the form with the default options from editors. So for the views, you already are familiar with style plugins. Those are an ordered list, an HTML list, and tables and grids. So custom style plugin will be useful when you have something with interactivity, for instance, tabs, accordions, masonry grid. So that's the candidates when you would want a custom style plugin. And I think those are all that I wanted to talk to you today. Let's check in the chat and see if we have any questions. Oops, hold on. I see, when is the best time to manipulate paging conditions, number of result, current page, Druid pause, normal page load, and via Ajax? So this is a very actually tricky question. It's a good question. It's a tricky question though. So it will be the best when you do have the results already. So it is in the post execute, you have it. The problem that you may have with it is that it passes the pager already in, and on some of the conditions, if you don't specify correctly how the pager is rendered, you may end up having the wrong number of pages. So what I recommend doing instead of that, instead of like saying the number of results or altering the pages, I recommend rendering, especially if you're using Ajax, I recommend rendering the whole all of the results, and then just setting up either a custom page or a JavaScript that will manipulate it in this way instead of doing it through the hook. Just in my experience, sometimes you may end up with bad pagination, but it depends on the basically on how your views are set up and your specific requirements. And yes, hook views post execute is the earliest where you can get your number of results and understanding of how many of them are there and alter certain things. So I don't recommend, so I recommend altering pager conditions in there, but I don't recommend unsetting results rows. If you do unset the results rows, your pager will definitely be broken, and this is where you will have to go with a custom pager. Are you going to show examples? That's a great question. Actually, I'm not planning to show examples at the moment. However, we just published Views for Developers on Drupalize Me series, so you can go and check the tutorials in depth there with some examples as well. With large volumes of data, is it faster to sort via the plugin or via the query? Natural source, right? So sorts are definitely, like, it's both of them, sort and query alter, both of them are going to be via the query. However, if you use custom sort, it means that you can reuse it multiple times on different views. It doesn't have to be used just on one of them. Technically, there is no big difference. However, the sort plugin happens earlier than your hook query alter. So obviously, as early in the process it happens, it's better it is for the performance. So I'd say that if you can, always go with the sort plugin. But depending on your structure and on performance and other things, and caching and other factors that how you build your view, you may or may not see a significant difference. However, if you were to go with the caching and you have a lot of results, I recommend to go with the plugin option. Will slides be posted somewhere? Definitely, slides will be attached to the session, and I will also tweet them out after the session. If you're browsing the Views module code, the Views API file has a lot of info about the hooks. Where is the info about the plugins documented? That's a fantastic question. Drupal actually has documentation for every single plugin, so you can just Google Views plugins, and it will post, like, one of the first results returns Drupal.org documentation where at least all of the plugins and all of the annotation requirements for all of them, all of the methods that can be used for them, and base classes. So I recommend checking that out. All right. Any other questions? I don't think I have any other questions. Yeah. Well, let me see. No more questions. Okay, well, if you want to connect, please feel free to either hit me on the Kalamuna website where you have all my credentials, or connect on Twitter at sunnyinotic. And yes, thank you so much for coming in, and enjoy your Drupal code.